Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The Making of Intelligent Lives. I am Dan Habib, a documentary filmmaker based at the Institute on Disability at the University of New Hampshire. This is a rebroadcast of a webinar originally recorded on August 9th, 2018. I'm really glad you joined us today. We won't be able to do the live chat like we did on the webinar, but we have a lot of information to share, and I'm really excited to introduce my co-host, Mike Wehmeyer, in just a little bit. We'll be talking about why we joined together on the production of the film Intelligent Lives. You'll see Mike as a really incredible expert and distinguished professor at Kansas University. He's been working for decades in the field of intellectual disability, both domestically and internationally, and he's got a lot of incredible insights to share. He's also been a key advisor on this film project, so I know you'll enjoy hearing from Mike. I want to just start by talking a little bit about why I made Intelligent Lives at this time in my life and my career. It largely goes back to Samuel. Once again, Samuel, my son, was the subject of my first film, including Samuel. And you see in the small photo here a picture of him in preschool that was taken from the film. Samuel's grown up a lot. He's now just a recent graduate of Concord High School, was at his prom recently. He stayed in general education throughout his school career, stayed on track for a regular diploma. He's taking college classes in the fall. He's going to be participating in the leadership series out of the University of New Hampshire Institute on Disability, which is part of the larger Partners in Policy Making. He's got his first paid job. He's doing a TV show on the local community access station. So I'm really excited about Samuel and all that he's doing in his transition, partly because of his point in life that he's transitioning to adulthood and out of high school. It got me interested in thinking about other stories of transition for students with disabilities and telling those stories. But there was another reason that Samuel motivated me to start this film. Samuel, because he navigates the world differently, using a wheelchair, using a communication device, is often seen as being less intelligent just because of the way he navigates the world. And that's really distressing to us when people on the street might talk to him like he's a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, even though he just graduated from high school. So I think there's this inherent perception that many people have of people with disabilities that they're somehow less intelligent. And it's certainly been something that's been a big part of our life. And I made Including Samuel in part to show the incredible value and importance that young adults with disabilities can have in regular education and the success they could have when they're provided with the proper supports. And those of you who've seen Including Samuel know that's kind of at the heart of that film. When I started showing Including Samuel around the country, people would continually say, okay, well, we can see how a kid with physical disabilities can be included, but what about someone with with emotional behavioral disabilities? Can they really be included with those kind of behavioral challenges? And so I ended up doing the film, Who Cares About Kelsey, focusing on a high school student with ADHD and a lot of post-traumatic stress and trauma in her background around sexual abuse and violence and drug and alcohol abuse in her family, and showing how a high school, Somersworth High School in New Hampshire, could use practices like positive behavioral support and person-centered planning to help Kelsey be successful. And that became the film, Who Cares About Kelsey, that I showed around the country in 2012, 2013, many times along with Kelsey, and it was broadcast on television in 2013. But even with that film, when I started showing that film around, people continue to be skeptical about one group of students and their capacity to be included, and that was students with intellectual disability. And friends of mine, people that I really trust as advisors like Mike, had talked to me about this idea that probably the single greatest obstacle to people with disabilities was the perception of intelligence. And so I took it upon myself to try and make a film that would challenge that notion. And before I started even working on that project, I did some research, and I found that, in fact, people with intellectual disability are the most segregated group of people in the United States. If you look at the statistics, 17% of students with intellectual disability are included by what is the federal standard of inclusion, meaning they spend at least 80% of their day in general education. And of those students with intellectual disability, only 40% will graduate from high school with a regular diploma by age 21. And indeed, once they leave school, only 15% will be employed. So those are incredibly high levels of segregation that I'm sure those of you who are listening today certainly want to see improved. And what I hope to do with this film was really challenge the notion that intelligence is a fixed or measurable characteristic. And things like the IQ test, and in addition to things like the SAT and other standardized tests, are basically built based on this idea that somehow we can measure a person's capacity or ability or intelligence. some of these assessments certainly can serve other purposes, but there's some real problems with both the nature of these standardized tests and also the repercussions of having a number attached to you, like an IQ test for the rest of your life. So I started thinking, well, how do I begin to challenge the notion that there's some fixed measurable way to measure intelligence? And I realized I needed some paradigm shifters. I needed people who could, through their own lived experience, challenge the notion that there's a way to measure a person's capacity or ability to contribute meaningfully to the world. I was very fortunate about 8 or 9 years ago to meet Chris Cooper, the Academy Award-winning actor of many films like Adaptation, the Bourne Conspiracy movies, The Muppets, many movies by John Sayles, an incredible actor who also has a very powerful life experience as being the father of a wonderful young man named Jesse. Jesse passed away at age 17. That was about 13 years ago, of a seizure-related disorder. But Jesse, much like Samuel, used a wheelchair, used a communication device, but was also, because of the hard work and advocacy of his parents, included in general education. Jesse was a paradigm shifter because eventually he mastered Latin and wrote poetry and affected so many people in his life. So Chris shares the personal story of Jesse in the film, but he also is the narrator for some of the historical portions of the film, which I'll get back to in a second. Micah Fialka-Feldman is a young man I met 6 or 7 years ago who you'll meet in Intelligent Lives. And Micah is certainly a paradigm shifter in that he attends classes at Syracuse University. He co-teaches classes at Syracuse. He's got a vibrant circle of friends, and he was given an IQ of 40 when he was a kid. But because of his family's advocacy and his own advocacy to be included in regular education and stay on track for a regular diploma, he ended up being able to go to college. Nair Shahid is a second major subject after Micah in the film. And Nair is somebody that I met through doing some work at the Henderson School in Boston. Henderson School is one of the most inclusive public high schools I've ever seen in the country. Once I got to know the school, I got to know Nair and the faculty there and saw the incredible work they were doing around co-teaching and universal design for learning, differentiated instruction. And I was able to see Nair's incredible artwork. And I spent about 3 years on and off from his freshman year to his senior year documenting Nair for this film. And then finally, I wanted to round out the film by showing someone in the employment realm. I had shown college, I had shown high school, but I really wanted to show employment as well. And after many months of searching, I found Naomi Montplaisir, who lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and is a young woman in her mid-20s. She has Down syndrome. She is from a family of Haitian descent. And Naomi's story is one of transitioning from sheltered workshop, a high school where she was actually made to do things like assemble jewelry for no or little pay, instead of learning math, instead of learning English and science. It's a tough story, but I'll tell you that it has some really positive outcomes over the year that I filmed Naomi and her family and her workplace. So those are the paradigm shifters. But then finally, getting back to the historical piece, I really wanted to put this in a historical context. And when we think of things like the modern day Me Too movement around women's rights and sexual harassment, can we really understand that movement unless we know that we are a country with a history of oppression and segregation and harassment of women in this country, and that women's rights are still very much an ongoing battle? Can we understand a movement like the Black Lives Matter movement unless we know that we are a country with a history of slavery and racism and segregation? Certainly that history very much informs and makes the modern day movement relevant of Black Lives Matter. Same with the disability rights movement and inclusive education movement. Unless we know that we are a country with a history of oppression and institutionalization, and in fact, forced sterilization of people with disabilities, can we really understand the modern day challenge to have people with disabilities fully integrated into school, into the workplace, into relationships, into community? So I really needed someone like Mike Wehmeyer, an expert in the field who spent decades of his life focusing on these issues, both historically and modern day, in order to help me tell this story.
Our son, Jesse, had cerebral palsy. When Jesse was 4, the neurologist told us that he would never be intellectually normal. We fought to have Jesse included in general education.
The IQ test measures a very limited potential of our brain to learn and misses all the other stuff.
Naomi, Micah, and Nair, 3 young adults with disabilities, unlocking their potential.
You happy with your tip you made?
Yeah.
You know what you're gonna buy with this?
Cell phone.
I'm getting a 9-degree certificate in disability studies.
Nair is not afraid to freely express himself.
Do you want to go to college?
Yeah.
When people say, why is your school successful? Because we include students with significant disabilities. We don't use IQ tests to inform us at all.
Not long ago, IQ testing was used to fuel a pseudoscience known as eugenics, which called for eliminating the menace of the feeble-minded. Institutions like Willowbrook more closely resembled prisons than schools.
We have to broaden our understanding of what intelligence is. I want my son to go into a world where he's looked at not there as a tall black guy who's acting weird.
Whether it's a police officer or a civilian, you do wonder what's going to happen.
I think because of Naomi's unconditional love for what she does, it's good for everyone.
Are you on Facebook?
No,
Okay.
my parents don't think that's safe.
What do you remember most about today?
Be ourselves.
Be ourselves.
Can any attempt to measure intelligence predict a person's value or ability to contribute meaningfully to the world?
So I'd like to now take a moment to hand off to Mike Wehmeyer. Mike, as I mentioned earlier, is an incredible advisor on this project. He's been working with me for many years on this, and has some things he'd like to share about his perspectives on the film and the clip we just saw and some of the work he's done. So, Mike, if I could go ahead and hand off to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I am broadcasting, aren't I? I hit the wrong button earlier in the day. So Dan approached me because of work that we had done over the years looking at the history of intellectual disability and the ways in which people with intellectual disability have been treated across time. I got into that work for a couple of reasons. For one, our work in promoting issues around the self-determination and autonomy of people with intellectual disability did, like Dan mentioned with his presentations, constantly sort of get challenged with the notion that because somebody has such and such an IQ and supposedly such and such a mental age, that they would be unable to become self-determined. And so a lot of our work has been talking about how we understand self-determination, but I began to realize that in many cases, it's more than about that. It's about how we understand disability and how disability is conceptualized. So I went back and began looking at the history of the field, and I asked, and I became interested in particularly this eugenics era. And Dan, why don't you go ahead and forward the slide there? Some of you will be aware of a book that I did with a friend and colleague, David Smith, called Good Blood, Bad Blood, Science, Nature, and the Myth of the Calicax. It's published by the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. It tells the story of a woman whose picture you see there in front of you, whose name in a small book by Henry Herbert Goddard, whose name was mentioned in the brief clip that you saw, as Deborah Calicac. And Goddard introduced the intelligence test and IQ testing to America in 1911, translating work from Binet from the French into English and beginning to use it in a variety of ways, including, as was depicted in there, its use in on Ellis Island, as well as its use in schools for identifying and basically segregating children and youth and adults with disability. The mantra of the eugenics era was that the way that we as a nation should respond to that, to the menace of the feeble-minded, was to segregate, separate, sterilize, and potentially just limit the opportunities of people who were deemed to be feeble-minded to be part of society and to procreate, if you will. So the Kallikak story, which I'm not going to go into any great detail, is a supposedly the illustration of a natural experiment in which a man nicknamed named Martin Kallikak has children from two different women, the first supposedly being a feeble-minded woman who the lineage, the ancestry from that union resulted in what Goddard talked about as being all feeble-minded or degenerate people, and then the other side of the Martin Kallikak married another woman and had all good people, and that's the story that's told in Good Blood, Bad Blood, and I won't give it all away other than to note that Goddard started writing the book with the end in mind and missed several key details. So it became apparent to me that through this, intelligence testing was a primary way that that people with intellectual disability were being understood. And as I read and as I got to know the history of the field, it became obvious that what intelligence testing was doing was not only selling people short, in my estimation, which I think Intelligent Lives does an excellent job of portraying, but it also was used as a tool to make people appear as if they were different. And if you look at the history of intellectual disability and the history of the way people who've been labeled as having intellectual disability have been treated and understood, it's pretty apparent that when we as a society understand and mark people as different in some way, shape, or form, it soon becomes considered as inferior and leads inevitably to discrimination and maltreatment. It leads to segregation and separation, and it leads to the lack of recognition of the basic dignity of people as simply persons who have dignity based upon their status as a human being. So when Dan came to me, we spent a couple of days, 2 days, Dan, is in my office, which is not the one you see in the background here. It was actually a cramped and smaller office, and we some of the ephemera, the books, and the pictures and the clippings you see in the film are from my collection here at the University of Kansas, and we talked through and began to kind of try to highlight not so much just why, not so much why intelligence testing is focusing on what intelligence testing had done to people with intellectual disability, and looking if there were any ways in which intelligence testing, other than having provided access in some cases to needed services, had really contributed. So we spent several days talking about this, and then over time I reviewed drafts of the dialogue. It's been interesting to watch that shaped over time, and it was interesting to then hear those words on paper come out of the mouths and listen to the mouth out of the mouth of Chris Cooper, whose voice is so familiar and obviously so dramatic. You know, and I think what I'm really pleased about, there's a lot of things to be pleased about the film, but fundamentally a visual film like this takes stories that, you know, can be compelling if written, but it's something completely different when you see some of the videos you saw of institutions, some of the images, the clips of immigrants on Ellis Island. It all adds a certain level of reality to it that the written word just can't do. So that was really the impetus for me wanting to be involved in this. And I think I'll turn it back over to Dan and let him take the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Let me, before I move on, we've got a couple minutes. There was a question from one of my colleagues, Joni Beasley, in the chat box, who said, what is your opinion about the shift to adaptive functioning, quote unquote, as a measure of ability? Does it still fall short of being inclusive and strength-based? Do you want to weigh in on that?
I assume that means adaptive behavior, which is, you know, that's a construct that actually was developed by one of Goddard's colleagues who actually didn't fall into quite the trap of the eugenics era over time. I think without getting deeply into the notion of replacing IQ with adaptive functioning, what our colleagues of mine within AAIDD and AAIDD has sort of taken at least one direction is that I'm more interested in what kinds of supports people need to be successful, and not as much on focusing and measuring deficits in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you know, adaptive behavior, adaptive functioning is still a measure of a personal competence, and there are uses I know for both intelligence testing and adaptive behavior measures that have utility, but in the broader scope of thing, I'm much more interested in how we move away from trying to capture proxy measures of personal incompetence and moving toward how we effectively capture what types of supports, duration, intensity of supports do people need to be successful, so that we can focus on that.
Can you talk, Mike, a little bit about, from your perspective, what some of the character stories in this film represent in terms of, you know, what they represent in terms of community-based lives in school, in college, and employment, and how that strikes you?
Yeah, you know, obviously the stories individually are very powerful. I've known Micah for probably as long as you have, Dan, and I think that when you came to Kansas in 2014 or wherever it was, as you began this journey, you pretty much already had an idea that Micah would somehow be featured in this, and I'm proud to say I'm a Facebook friend with Micah, so you know, I knew that his story would be very powerful. Micah was a pioneer in when he was in Michigan. He was sued a university to get access to the opportunity to live in dorm. He and his family have been very active in efforts to ensure not only Micah's inclusion, but the inclusion of all people. And then I think you found Nair fairly soon after that, and I hadn't met Nair before the film, but obviously his story is intriguing. I think there's some really interesting, I think Nair tells an important story because he has had some communication and behavioral issues that people interpret. You know, there's a comment in the film from one of the one of the teachers at the school talking about looking forward, you know, the concern that people would look at Micah, see a rather tall black man engaged in certain, you know, certain, you know, hard to interpret behaviors, and that it would be he would be stereotyped by all of those stereotypes. I think the most exciting one addition was Naomi's story, and it took a while for you to find Naomi. We worked, Carrie Sjogren, who's a colleague here at Kansas, and I have in fact worked in the state of Rhode Island with their response to the Department of Justice decree pertaining to Olmstead and their the use of sheltered employment as being in violation of the ADA. And you know, we were trying to think of somebody with intellectual disability who had more extensive support needs, who had been successful, and it seemed like every road we went down wasn't very successful. And you found Naomi, and Naomi's story, and it parallels what's in the other stories, that what it tells us about inclusive education, what it tells us about employment, what it tells us about participation, which is part of what we've been talking about, and what it tells us about this issue that I raised earlier, that people are presumed to be somehow different. Naomi's story is one of relationships. The viewers met her brother very briefly. They meet her mother. They meet her church support family. And eventually they meet in an employment setting a group of people who seem to value her for who she is. You know, there's a process of learning some skills that are associated with the job. But fundamentally, Naomi gets a job because people value her and see her strengths more than what they perceive to be her limitations or her disability. And I think that's true across all of these stories. Micah's family and Micah have been longtime pioneers, and he's had, you know, any number of accomplishments. And you know, what I love about Micah's story is that, you know, he pushes that story pushes the boundary about what a lot of people will feel comfortable in terms of full participation, online dating and girlfriends. And you know, Micah's a young man who has the same desires and wants and dreams and hopes that all young men, or many young men, have. And so we see Micah's family, but not as prominently probably as Naomi's family and Nair's family. And Nair's family, there's a really powerful segment toward the end of the film where Nair is interacting with his sisters, and his mother and his father are talking, and it really talks about the incredible power of relationships. And I think as you know, that's one thing that this film hammers home about inclusion and participation, is that these things emerge out of meaningful relationships, and that when you get to know people and you look at who they are and what their strengths are, it takes you beyond what a number. I think Micah said his IQ score had been tested at 40. What does that mean? You know, that would startle some people, and certainly, you know, it means absolutely nothing in terms of Micah's life. I mean, it's completely irrelevant. So, you know, I think it's very powerful to see each of these young people and their gifts and talents, and obviously Nair's gifts around artistic and in his vision and his eye is something that you see shining through. And then with Naomi, the fact that a young person who does require more extensive support needs can in fact become part of a community and work in a meaningful way in the part of life. So there's just something so much more powerful about seeing that. And I think with Naomi's story particularly, we get to see it from sort of a job training thing. You saw the segment there in the State House at the Rhode Island State House in one type of a role, but then there's a discussion about her desires and her dreams through a person-centered planning process that then we see that come to fruition. So, you know, a lot of times, I mean, it's not uncommon to have kind of these work training experiences, but in my experience, that often doesn't parallel with the kinds of passions and dreams. What is it that young people really want to do? And then to see Naomi then go through and have opportunities that bring that to fruition is particularly powerful.
I think, Mike, you just touched on so many things that I was hoping you would touch on, so thank you so much. There's, you know, one of the things that Chris Cooper has said a lot, Chris and his wife, Marianne, who've been also executive producers on the film, have been very involved in this project. They've done probably 5 events with us recently. Chris says that in every case of these characters, there's a really innovative community around them and a structure. And in Micah, it's this incredible Syracuse community as well. As everyone has their family in each case. But for Micah, he also has the Syracuse community. And he has this circle of support that he organizes that you'll see in the film around, you know, building this circle of peers that can help him make important decisions in life and do some kind of supported decision making, so to speak. Nair has a Henderson School. And actually we have I see on the webinar today, Amy Galunas, who's the inclusion director at Henderson. And in the film, you'll hear Amy say how Nair did come with some very challenging behavior when he was young. But at Henderson, we recognize that behavior is a form of communication. And in a lot of schools, people would have said, whoa, inclusion is not for us, for a kid like Nair, who might be, you know, accidentally hitting people or knocking people over, which, you know, when he was younger, it was a much bigger issue. But once he found the outlet of the expression of art, you saw his behavior decrease, challenging behavior, because he had a way to communicate and express himself. And as Mike said, Naomi, I think at first in that State House scene, it was interesting when we were editing this, you know, we were seeing just through the footage that Naomi wasn't that successful in a scene where she was trying, in a job where she was trying to count change and when she had a lot of math skills. Once she got into a much more social, kind of tactile environment of the beauty salon, which I know you're going to enjoy when you see the whole movie, when Naomi ends up, I won't give you the spoiler, but she ends up having a lot of success in this beauty salon, which is probably the most welcoming community I've ever been in my life. And also, it's an incredibly important part of her social life now, to have a workplace where she's embraced and accepted for who she is. So, you know, it's really, you know, my editor, I worked with a very talented editor, James Rudenbeck, who also happens to have an adult son with autism, who is not a nonverbal communicator. And he also had a really sensitive and light touch to understanding how we could build these stories and also show their very real challenges. I mean, we didn't want to sugarcoat the reality that Micah is still struggling with how to navigate dating, and Nair was still struggling with some of his behavior and communication. And Naomi has a lot of health issues, a lot of other issues that were difficult. And her brother Steve is her guardian and is also trying to like lead this whole family that is very stressed in terms of some health issues, some economic issues. His parents are English language, her parents are English language learners, their parents. So there's a scene in which you'll see where Naomi's family was told that the Birch School in Rhode Island was the best fit for Naomi. Well, the Birch School ended up being a sheltered workshop where she was being asked to assemble jewelry for little or no pay instead of learning English and math and science. And the Birch School was actually cited by the U.S. Department of Justice and Eve Hill as a lead in that case as kind of the worst of the worst situations in Rhode Island that led to a complete systems change in Rhode Island. And it started with Naomi's school, where she was in high school for 7 years. So you'll see that her story, I think, is very powerful. Let me, if I indulge me here, we're gonna I see all the questions coming in, and we're gonna try and answer those directly. But I wanted to just take a minute and show you how you can host a screening in the community. We've actually been getting some requests as we've been going through here, people asking us, well, how do we get this into our community? So if you go to the Intelligent Lives website, which I hope you can see on the screen now, you're gonna see something called Host a Screening. Does everyone see that? Mike, you can tell me, are you seeing that all right?
Yeah.
Great. And what we've done is, I've never done this before with the films, and we just launched this a couple of days ago, and it's been very, very successful. Basically, there are 2 different ways that you can launch a screening of the film. You can either host a screening through the Host a Screening page right here, and that is the host a screening in a theater, or you can host a screening in a school or community. And if you go to the host a screening in the theater page, we're working with an organization called Gather, which is a really cool model where they have relationships with movie theaters all over the country, where you can actually go into your host a screening button, and this page gives you a lot more information, and it tells you where there are theaters in your community that can host the film. And there's actually no financial cost. You just need to rally your friends, and we'll tell you how to do that. If you sign up, we'll give you all the tools and tips to buy anywhere from like 40 to 50 tickets in any community you need to have sold in order to tip the screening and make it happen. So it's a pretty cool model. There's no financial risk to anybody, and it's a way to get the movie into your own local theater and have a Q&A, kind of question and answer discussion afterwards about it. The other way we can host screenings all over the country is we just released our education kit for the film. And if you click on the education kit tab, you're going to get to this page, and it gives you all the information. Right now, we're just selling an education kit, not an individual DVD, because we're going to be waiting for broadcast until we do that, until after broadcast. But the kit contains not just the full film with captioning and audio description, but I've also done 4 short films on effective practices in post-secondary transition. And I traveled all around the country doing separate films because there was so much to tell about what was happening out in the country around transition. So those are on there as well with open captions. And then finally, I did a film called Mr. Connolly Has ALS that some of you may be familiar with, that to me is one of the best stories I've ever told about the hearts and minds reason to have inclusive education. And so that film is on there as well. And then we have a lot of educational materials. So we did just release a new trailer, and the trailer we just released it yesterday, actually. And the trailer is up on our Facebook page. And I'm not one to claim that my work goes viral, but this is kind of like the most viral I've ever gotten. As of yesterday, we had 1,000 shares on the film, 40,000 views, and it's reached about 135,000 people. So if you want to see the trailer, I'd encourage you to just check out the Facebook page. And it's a good way to get to know the film. So I don't want this to be too heavy a pitch, but I really wanted to let you know how this is all going to be out there. People have asked on the chat, what are the audiences for this film? And, I think, obviously, Mike, you can chime in, but I'll start. I think we have some incredible national outreach partners on the film, many of whom represent the college environment. So we have like Think College on board, and we have the National Center on Transition. If you go to our national outreach partner list, you'll see TASH, you'll see, I know some people from TASH are on this call, you'll see a bunch of groups that are on our outreach team. And I think that there are a lot of transition specialists around the country, a lot of educators, a lot of employment groups. We want businesses to engage with this, especially around some of the employment issues that we're focusing on. We think that that certainly this has to start in early childhood, this idea of inclusion for students with intellectual disability. You can't just ideally, you don't launch into it in high school or middle school or in college. You start from a very young age. And a lot of these groups, like the National Down Syndrome Congress, and a lot of these other groups are focused on early childhood inclusion.
Hey, Dan, can I point out that one of your national outreach partners and a group that you worked with throughout the film is the National Association of School Psychologists.
That's right.
Of course, that's an audience that uses intelligence testing because of the way that systems are structured. And I thought early on that it was really important to tell this story without impugning people necessarily who other than the 100 years ago people that I thought that the fact that that organization and some of the folks within it were very supportive of the film and had an opportunity to review it. I think it says something about the fact that this is a broad sense and not just a fringe group thinking that this is. And I know that I've served on the AAIDD terminology classification systems. The last couple of manuals have emphasize that, first of all, people should not be classified or diagnosed unless there's obvious benefit to them.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, if systems are arranged so that you have to qualify by certain means, then there may be a need for that now, and that particularly with the notion of mental age, which I find even more problematic than just straight IQ. A mythology that has been created that mental age means something when it really means means nothing.
Right.
And the AAIDD manual basically says don't use mental aids. There's really
Yeah.
no utility to that as a construct. So
That's a great, really excellent point. And just to go on to what you said about NASP a little bit, National Association of School Psychologists, they certainly went out on a limb to support this film and be partners because, as you say, they are implementing intelligence tests to a large degree around the states. We did a survey with NASP to find out who was using IQ tests and who wasn't. And we found that 49 out of 50 states are still using intelligence tests as one measure to determine the label of intellectual disability, which of course often ends up determining placement in some communities. That label, that IQ score can often have an impact on placement. Not always, but it often does. But one of the things that I really appreciate from NASP is they connected me with Bob Lichtenstein, who is a well-known school psychologist within that community. And he did a interview with us where he said, one of the problems with this whole testing is that the reports are being written in a way that it's very inaccessible, that you're not getting a lot of valuable information. A lot of psychologists, this is just coming from Bob, who teaches school psychologists, saying they're writing it to almost impress their colleagues. They're not writing it to really translate the information in a functional, usable way to families, to educators. And so what happens is the number is the one thing that people can kind of glean from it. So Bob wrote a really tremendous series for the National Association of School Psychologists that we'll make available in our resources when we launch those around that issue. And, some groups have pushed back on this idea that we're challenging IQ testing, but I'd like to take the long view of it and say, as we've seen with things like support intensity scale, there is probably a better mechanism for determining eligibility and support needs than what we're currently using. And rather than getting stuck on the current systems of determining eligibility for IQ testing, maybe there's a different way forward.
I think one of the things I wanted to add in was that I mentioned Chris Cooper's voice and his presence, which is obviously compelling. But, one of the things that makes this a very powerful film is Chris's personal experiences. And there are times in the film you can tell when he's talking about these things that it's a voice of personal experience, just like your experience, Dan. It's not just an actor or somebody who's familiar reading a script. I mean, there's lots of cases in which that is a very effective way to communicate. Right. But Chris Cooper's narration and his visual appearance, you can tell that this is something that is dear to him and his family and the life of Jesse. And that story in and of itself is, I think, compelling.
Yeah, one of the things appreciate bringing that up. One of the things that Marianne Leon Cooper, Chris's wife and Jesse's mother, talks a lot about, and she's very active in this film, is the fact that and unfortunately this is still happening, they received a tremendous amount of pushback for when they wanted to include Jesse in regular education. I mean, Jesse unfortunately died at age 17, 13 years ago. So he would be about 30 now. So when he was 5 years old, we're talking 20, 25 years ago, they were being told that Jesse couldn't function in a regular education class. I do speaking all around the country, and I find that is still being told to parents, that kids with cerebral palsy, with Down syndrome, with autism, can't even go to a regular kindergarten. And it's the thing that really changed the game for Marianne is they organized as parents. The parents of the community got together and they finally found a common voice, and they were actually able to lobby and have the school move past and actually dismiss the special ed director. That was the biggest obstacle to the change. So again, I think it's a powerful story around parents organizing. And I should say that Marianne, in terms of how this film all came together, Marianne wrote a book called Jesse, A Mother's Story, which is an absolutely incredibly powerful book, if you can get your hands on it, about their journey with Jesse and their battle for inclusion. And a lot of the scripting that we had, a lot of the words that Chris read, we worked together, Chris, Marianne, and I, to kind of craft that narration around things that came up in that book. And I just want to tell one other quick backstory that people might be interested to know about how a film like this comes together. Music is a really important part of any film. And so I was fortunate to find a really wonderful composer named Paul Brill, who does a lot of the original music in the film. But I also, when I did Who Cares About Kelsey, I met the head of the school social work association, Rochelle Lieber Miller, who's the president at the time. And she told me, have you ever thought about having more like commercial music or celebrity music in your movies? And I said, well, I don't really know. I can't afford that. And she said, well, my son is this artist named Modest Yahoo. And he's, some of you may know, is a very well-known rap reggae artist. And so Modest Yahoo saw Who Cares About Kelsey, saw Including Samuel, and decided to donate the music to the film. So we use 4 of his songs in the film. So it really does kind of take a village. And then finally, I should mention that Nair's paintings, he brought them to one of our openings, his original paintings, and they were beautiful, large paintings, and he put them out in the lobby and he made them for sale for like a couple $100s each. He sold all of them within 10 minutes after the screening, walked out with a couple $1,000s, but I did buy a couple of his paintings before they all left, and we turned them into posters, and we're selling them, and all the proceeds go back to the Henderson Art School program. So before long, you'll see that on our website as well. I'm just looking at the comments, see if there's anything we want to address in the last minute or two, Mike.
I just want to say that you asked who the audience is. The work we've done Good Blood, Bad Blood was really intended for a general public audience written as such, but it's really hard to get things in front of that audience. So the folks that are on this webinar, the degree that you can get this out to audiences who aren't familiar with intellectual disability or autism or disability in general, that's the audience that I think has really power to influence and to begin to see change, and that's who we have to change if we're going to achieve the kinds of outcomes that all of us want for the people we work with, that we support, that we care about.
Yeah. Mike, we're going to, if it's okay, we'll just linger a few more minutes to answer a few more questions. Some people may need to sign off, and we understand that. But somebody just asked, I wonder if you want to try and take this on, how can there be more inclusive post-secondary opportunities in an era when most high school transition programs are segregated programs with insufficient academic preparation for college? So are we almost like putting the cart before the horse to have almost 300 inclusive college programs now through the Think College Network and other opportunities, when we haven't even gotten high schools, to be inclusive? Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that if we wait for high schools to be fully inclusive, we'll never get there. So, we have to provide. I think the power of inclusive post-secondary education programs that are owned by universities and by community colleges and other post-secondary entities is that they provide, again, an illustration that people can be successful. I know that the post-secondary education program here at the University of Kansas, one of the bigger difficulties is that young people haven't been prepared to come and to be able to be successful in an environment, because they've been mainly segregated. They've been mainly put in self-contained classrooms, but I think there's going to be some trickle back. I mean, if families are going to say, what does it take to get into these kinds of programs? And one of the messages is we've got to create more inclusive secondary settings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there can be some backwash there that can make high schools and to create more inclusive settings. It's, the pace at which, when I was with the Arc of the United States in the 90s, they did an annual report card on inclusion, and using the same data you reported on, and throughout that time, people moved from young people with intellectual disability moved from being in general education 80% or more of the day, from about 5% to about 9%. Well, that was by 1999. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that we're only at 17% by the time we hit 2018. I mean, we're not even gaining a percentage point a year. So, we need to shake it up. And of course, I think parental advocacy is the strongest thing that can shape these things.
Yeah. And, and I also think you don't need a whole program to make colleges more accessible. We have a community college in town. Samuel's going to start taking a class there next year. We met with their accessibility services departments, and they were really proactive about the type of accommodation Samuel would need to be successful in college. He met with the professor he's got next year, and he's actually taking a class called Mindful Communication. So it's a communication mindfulness class. And she said, I think this is going to be fantastic to have a student in the class that communicates in such a different way than the other students, using a communication device or speaking with a lot of effort and very slowly. So she was actually seeing it as a real plus to the diversity of the college environment. And I think that's kind of what I'm sure many of us share, is the hope that someday disability is seen as a completely natural and valuable part of our diversity, and it actually enriches places like college campuses. It enriches high schools, and that's why I love being at Henderson School, because they have a long tradition of being probably one of the most inclusive school districts in schools in the country, but they're a bit of an island in Boston still. And I know the principal, Patricia Lampert, and others don't want to be an island. They want to see more and more schools being seen as inclusive, but unfortunately, sometimes you have the inclusive school within a large district, and the district thinks they've kind of done their job at that point.
Well, again, it's about relationships so many times. If we, when young people, when children have experiences to create friendships with children in elementary school, as I think, including Samuel showed, Dan, they grow up with kids with disabilities who are their friends, and they don't think of them as different. And we don't have these issues at the secondary level, and there's been progress, but we haven't moved anywhere near quickly enough.
I agree. And I really appreciate Sarah's comment here in the chat box where she says, it's actually just to all panelists. I'll paste it into the whole chat box. But she wrote, not all students want to go to college. Don't forget skilled employment training, pastry arts, and other. Naomi realized her dreams, which did not include college. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that was a really important point for me in the film, was to make sure I showed different pathways that people choose to adulthood. And I did that in the mini films I mentioned earlier, the transition films, which are going to be up on our website before long. And actually, Samuel Teixeira, who's one of Nair's teachers, very eloquently in the film says, college may not be for everybody. Maybe if Nair wants to go to college, that's great. But the trades are an undervalued part of our experience in this country. And Mr. Teixeira says college is overvalued. That's a judgment call. People may agree or disagree. But I think that it's really important that the Samuels, the Nairs, the Naomis, the Micahs have real meaningful various pathways to adulthood that they can choose, just like my older son Isaiah or anyone else, that they may want to go right into employment or the trades. They may want to go to college. They may want to, have different experiences. And to me, that's the key, is that there are actual pathways for students like there would be for any other student. I'm just looking at the points here. Unlike high schools, colleges are very accepting and accommodating. Oh, this is another one just to the panelists. Let me paste that into the chat box. This was something that that Michelle just said. Unlike high schools, colleges are very accepting and accommodating. My daughter is doing very well in college despite not being prepared by her high school. Do you find that, Mike, in the college environment where you are in Kansas?
Well, I think it is, because at this point, not every college in the country has to support people with intellectual disability or autism, or and so I think that what we have is a relatively small network, although it's an amazingly big network in some contexts, of universities and colleges who have said, we want to do this. This fits our mission. We want to support diverse people and students, but that there are an awful lot of universities and colleges who haven't done that, and so I think that. It's the tip of the iceberg in terms of that. But I think that the good news is that those programs that are out there through Think College are programs that have basically said, we want to do this. We're going to invest in this. So.
Right. Mike, I'm getting a bunch of questions, some private questions too, about where the film is going to be shown. I just wanted to mention that we have a long list on our screenings page of places the film's going to be shown. If you're out in California, we have 3 events in LA area in mid-September. And then if you're in New York area, New York City, we're doing a full week run starting September 21st through the 27th in the Village in Manhattan. That's going to be our national theatrical premiere. You can go to this website to see more. We're going to be at 2 other places in New York, at Long Island University, Westchester Institute of Human Development. And then we're going to be in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club on September 26th. And then October is where we're gearing our National Screening Month for screenings all over the country. So lots of reasons, lots of places to check out the film or host it. We're going to wrap up in just a couple minutes here, although I appreciate everyone staying on here. Let's see. Elizabeth says, I love this movie because it gets the discussion going about how human capability is valued in our country. Everyone has something great to contribute to communities as citizens, as people. And I think you'll find the people that know Naomi, that know Micah, that know Nair will say that I've benefited so much more from knowing Nair or Micah or Naomi than they have probably benefited from me. And students who have that inclusive experience in school, it's just such a much more rich experience.
Well, that's what I mentioned it, but what I love, one of the things I love about this is that there's a constant emphasis for each of these three main characters or featured folks on their strengths across time. And I think I know from my own work and I know from just interacting that we spend too little time talking about those issues of strengths and what people bring to the table. And
right.
And so I think that's a really powerful message.
Great. I think we should probably wrap it up. We've got a lot of comments, but we're going to make sure to make this whole piece available to people online on our Facebook page in coming days. So I just want to make sure everyone knows how to connect with us through theintelligentlives.org, through our social media here on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Mike, you can find him online if you can track him down. He's always incredible at staying in touch with a lot of people. But most of all, I really want to thank you all for being part of this webinar, and I am so happy that it went well. Thank Art Frick, who's behind the scenes making all this happen on a technological basis. And Mike, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. Really, really appreciate all your help and insights.
It's great, Dan. I was just one more comment. I see Ginger posting as somebody who has personal experience with a disability who's working on her own. It's screened up, but person-centered planning and self-advocacy. So go, Ginger.
That's right, Ginger. And you're going to see a number of, I think you're going to see the film is throughout the whole film, you're going to see examples of person-centered planning and tremendous self-advocacy on the part of the central characters. And I guess it made me think of one last comment I just thought of. One of the challenges in making this film was the fact that how do you make sure to give each character a voice when some characters, particularly Naomi and Nair, have trouble speaking in a traditional way. And so we tried really hard to give Naomi and Nair a platform in whatever way they wanted to express themselves through their, through Naomi and her own body language and the way she emoted and interacted with people, through Nair's artwork. And Micah is incredibly verbal and incredibly well-spoken about his own life. So we ended up leaning a little more on the families of Nair and Naomi also to share and tell their story, because Micah was able to tell his story quite directly, I think, throughout the film, which is, you mentioned earlier that Micah's family was a little bit less featured than the others, and that was probably wise because Micah told his story so clearly, and so we didn't have to rely on the family quite as much to share the story. So anyway, I think that's a great way to wrap it up, and really appreciate all the nice comments that are coming through, and we can't wait to share this whole film with you when we get to your community. Please host a screening in your community. Mike, thanks again for all your help over the last few years on this project.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been a really interesting ride, and every time I've seen the film 20 times now, and it never fails to amaze and to move. So
thank you. Good. Well, good day, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.